right is ours. The right is ours.
Your right is ours.
Hi, I'm Rick Bjella, the Artistic Director for the San Antonio Chamber Choir. We're very excited to present our concert upcoming on October 15th called Rightfully Hers. In the next few weeks, we'll share just a little gem of history with my wife, who has done about a year and a half of study on suffrage rights and look at some of the major figures. Hope you enjoy. In putting together the upcoming concert called Rightfully Hers, my much better half sitting next to me, Linda Bjella, has been instrumental in assisting with so much of the historical background that makes up the main purposes for having this concert in the first place. Thank you for your significant contribution and support in helping this become a reality. You've been working on presentations around the country in celebration of the 100th anniversary of women's suffrage rights with a coalition of women's groups for about a year and a half, I believe, up to the August 2020 celebration. But the journey for women was a long one. Can you talk a bit about that difficult journey?
Well, if we mark the beginning of the women's suffrage movement in America to the Seneca Falls Convention in 1848, that occurred 72 years after the Constitution was written, and the 19th Amendment granting women's suffrage wasn't passed until 1920, which was 72 years later. So it was a 144-year-long journey for women to get the vote in our country. The women's rights movement in our country really started with the abolitionist movement. Elizabeth Cady Stanton began her journey in activism as an abolitionist, and she met another key figure in the women's rights movement, Lucretia Mott, at the 1840 Abolitionist Convention in London. And at this convention, only the men were allowed to vote on the floor and debate the questions. The women were seated behind a screen and were told that they were not allowed to speak. So Mrs. Mott and Mrs. Stanton sat behind that screen and they fumed over their exclusion from the proceedings. And before they left London, they vowed to hold a women's rights convention in America. So 8 years later, in 1848, Elizabeth Cady Stanton was living in Seneca Falls, New York. But they were not the only women that were living there at the time. Seneca Falls was situated on Haudenosaunee, or what we often call Iroquois land. And these early suffragists had contact with Haudenosaunee women. And what they saw in that society was what they decided they wanted, because European American women really had no rights whatsoever. They were just considered the property of their husband. They had no legal rights to property. They didn't even have rights to their children in the case of a divorce. So what they wanted was what they saw in the indigenous society for themselves.
You